Margaret Chen had always considered herself lucky. At 28 years old, she drove a Mercedes that cost more than most people's houses, wore clothes that required dry cleaning after every use, and never once worried about checking her bank account before making a purchase. Life had been comfortable, perhaps too comfortable, and she had grown accustomed to things simply working out in her favor. That Tuesday afternoon in late September started like any other. She had just finished a tennis match at the Riverside Country Club, laughing with friends over iced lattes about their upcoming trip to Napa Valley. The sun was setting as she decided to drive back to the city, taking the scenic route through the countryside because she had nothing pressing to do and the weather was perfect. About 40 miles outside Portland, Oregon, her fuel light blinked on. Margaret wasn't worried. There would be a gas station soon enough, and even if there wasn't, what was the worst that could happen? Someone would come help her. Someone always did. She pulled into a small gas station just as the sky turned that particular shade of orange that makes everything look like a postcard. The place was nothing like the modern stations she usually visited in the city. This one had only 4 pumps, a small convenience store with flickering fluorescent lights, and a hand-painted sign that read Ted's Gas and Snacks in faded red letters. Margaret stepped out of her car, her tennis shoes crunching on the gravel. She filled up her tank watching the numbers climb on the old-fashioned pump display. $73.50. She reached for her purse, that expensive leather bag that matched her outfit perfectly, and began digging through it. Her wallet wasn't there. She checked again, more carefully this time, pulling out her sunglasses, her lipstick, her keys, a pack of mints. No wallet. Her heart started beating a little faster. She must have left it in her locker at the country club. She always took it out when she played tennis because it was bulky, and she must have forgotten to put it back in her purse. No problem, she thought. She would just use her phone to pay. But when she pulled out her iPhone, the screen remained black. Dead battery. Of course. She had been on it all afternoon, scrolling through social media and texting friends, and hadn't thought to charge it. Margaret walked into the convenience store, trying to maintain her composure. The attendant was a middle-aged man with a weathered face and kind eyes. He was helping another customer, so she waited, her mind racing through possible solutions. "That'll be $73.50, the attendant said when she approached the counter. "I'm so sorry," Margaret said, feeling her cheeks grow warm. "I left my wallet at the country club, and my phone is dead. Is there any way I could possibly—" The attendant's expression didn't change, but she could see him stiffen slightly. "I'm sorry, miss, but we need payment before you leave. Company policy." "I understand," Margaret said quickly. "Could I maybe give you my information? I can come back tomorrow first thing and pay double, I promise. Or I could call someone if you have a phone I could use." The attendant hesitated. It was clear he wanted to help, but rules were rules. Behind her, Margaret heard the door chime as another customer entered. She felt embarrassed now, very aware of her expensive clothes and car parked outside with a full tank of gas she couldn't pay for. "The payphone outside is broken," the attendant said apologetically. "Has been for a week. I can let you use the store phone, but it's only for local calls." Margaret nodded, though she realized she didn't actually know anyone's phone number by heart. Everything was saved in her contacts. She stared at the phone on the counter, feeling foolish and helpless in a way she had never experienced before. "I can pay for her gas." The voice came from behind her, quiet but steady. Margaret turned around to see an elderly man standing a few feet away. He must have been the customer who had just walked in. He looked to be in his early 70s, with silver hair and deep lines around his eyes that suggested a lifetime of smiling. He wore simple clothes, a flannel shirt and jeans that had clearly been washed many times, and work boots that had seen better days. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly," Margaret said immediately. "That's so kind, but I'll figure something out." The old man was already walking to the counter, reaching into his back pocket. "It's no trouble at all," he said simply. He pulled out a worn leather wallet held together with duct tape and began counting out bills. They were crumpled, mostly 10s and 5s, and he smoothed them out carefully before handing them to the attendant. Margaret watched, stunned into silence. The money looked like it mattered to this man, like these weren't bills he could easily spare. Yet here he was, paying for a complete stranger's gas without hesitation. $73.50, the attendant confirmed, taking the money and opening the cash register. "Wait," Margaret said, finding her voice. "Please, I need to know your name, your address, something. I'll pay you back tomorrow, I swear, with interest." The old man smiled at her, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "No need for all that," he said. "Just pay it forward someday when you see someone who needs help." "But I insist," Margaret pressed. "This is so incredibly generous, and I promise I'm good for it. I just made a stupid mistake today." The old man was already heading toward the door. "We all make mistakes," he called back. "Don't worry about it." "Please," Margaret said, following him outside. "At least let me get your name." He paused at his truck. An old pickup that was probably twice Margaret's age, with rust spots on the fenders and a dent in the passenger door. "Name's Frank," he said. "Frank Morrison. But really, miss, you don't owe me anything." "Frank," Margaret repeated, committing it to memory. "I'm Margaret, and I do owe you. At least let me know where I can find you to pay you back." Frank climbed into his truck with some effort, his movements careful like someone whose joints didn't work quite as well as they used to. "I come through here pretty regular," he said, "but honestly, forget about it. Have a safe drive home." Before Margaret could say anything else, Frank started his engine, which coughed and sputtered before settling into a rough idle. He gave her a small wave and drove off, his taillights disappearing down the highway as the last light faded from the sky. Margaret stood there in the parking lot for a long moment, watching the empty road. She had been helped by strangers before, sure, but never like this. Never by someone who looked like they might actually need that $73.50 for themselves. The attendant had gone back inside, and she was alone with her thoughts and her expensive car, and a strange feeling in her chest that she couldn't quite name. She walked back into the store and asked the attendant if he knew Frank. "Sure," the man said. "Frank comes in a couple times a week. Good man. Always has a kind word for everyone." "Does he live around here?" Margaret asked. The attendant studied her for a moment, then seemed to decide she was trustworthy. "About 15 miles east, near Meadowbrook, little house on Maple Street, though I don't know the exact number. Can't miss his truck, though." Margaret thanked him and walked back to her car. She sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine, looking at the gas gauge that now read full. Tomorrow, she would find Frank Morrison. She would pay him back, properly, the way you were supposed to. And maybe, she thought as she pulled onto the highway, she would ask him why he did it. Because there was something about that simple act of kindness that had shaken something loose inside her, and she needed to understand what it meant. Margaret didn't sleep well that night. She kept thinking about Frank Morrison and his worn wallet held together with duct tape, the way he had counted out those bills so carefully before handing them over. She had driven straight back to the country club after leaving the gas station, retrieved her wallet from her locker exactly where she'd left it, and gone home to her apartment overlooking the city. Everything in her life had returned to normal within an hour, but something felt different. The next morning, she woke up early with a sense of purpose she rarely felt. She got dressed, grabbed her purse, and made sure her wallet was actually inside it this time. Then she drove back out to that gas station, the receipt from yesterday tucked safely in her pocket. The same attendant was working when she arrived. "You came back," he said, sounding surprised. "I told you I would," Margaret replied. I need to find Frank Morrison. You said he lives near Meadowbrook on Maple Street? The attendant nodded slowly. Yeah, but miss, are you sure? Frank said not to worry about it. I'm sure, Margaret said firmly. Can you give me better directions? 20 minutes later, Margaret was driving through a neighborhood she would never have visited otherwise. The houses here were small and old, most of them needing repairs that probably cost more than the owners could afford. Some yards were neatly kept, despite their age, with flower gardens and trimmed hedges, while others had given up the fight against time and weather. She spotted Frank's truck before she saw the house number. It was parked in a narrow driveway next to a small single-story home that might have been charming once, maybe 30 or 40 years ago. Now the white paint was peeling off in long strips, revealing gray wood underneath. The front porch sagged slightly on one side, and the yard was overgrown with weeds that reached almost to her knees. Margaret sat in her car for a moment, suddenly feeling intrusive. What was she doing here? Frank had said not to worry about it. Maybe she should just mail him a check and leave him alone. But something made her turn off the engine and step out onto the cracked sidewalk. She walked up to the front door, her footsteps echoing on the wooden porch. Before she could knock, the door opened. Frank stood there in different clothes but looking exactly the same, that same gentle expression on his weathered face. Well, he said, surprise evident in his voice. Didn't expect to see you again. I told you I'd pay you back, Margaret said, pulling 5 $20 bills from her wallet. Here's 100. Please take it. You saved me yesterday. Frank looked at the money but didn't reach for it. The gas was $73.50, he said. If you really feel like you need to do this, then $73.50 is what you should pay. But I want to give you more, Margaret insisted, as a thank you. Then it wouldn't be paying me back anymore, Frank said with a small smile. It would be something else. And I don't need something else. I did what anyone should do. Margaret found herself laughing despite her frustration. You're really not going to make this easy, are you? Come on in, Frank said, stepping aside. At least let me offer you some coffee. It's already made. The inside of Frank's house was like stepping into a different time. The furniture was old but clean, the kind of stuff people used to build to last forever. Crocheted blankets draped over the couch, photographs lined the walls in mismatched frames, and everything smelled faintly of coffee and old books. It was nothing like Margaret's modern apartment with its minimalist design and expensive art. Frank shuffled into the small kitchen and returned with 2 mugs of coffee. They sat down in the living room, and Margaret found herself studying the photographs on the walls. Most of them showed Frank with a woman who must have been his wife, both of them younger and happier in those frozen moments. That's my Helen, Frank said, noticing where Margaret was looking. She passed 2 years ago. Cancer. I'm so sorry, Margaret said quietly. Frank nodded, staring at one particular photo where he and Helen stood in front of what looked like a small bakery, both wearing aprons and huge smiles. We had 43 good years together. Can't complain about that. They talked for nearly an hour. Margaret learned that Frank was 72, that he had worked at a furniture factory for 30 years before it closed down. He told her about the bakery he and Helen had owned for a while, how they'd put everything they had into it, and how it had failed during the recession in 2008. Lost everything, Frank said matter-of-factly, without self-pity. The business, our savings, nearly the house. We spent years paying off the debts. Could have declared bankruptcy, but Helen and we always believed in paying what we owed. Margaret felt something twist in her chest. Here was a man who had lost everything, who lived in this small, deteriorating house, who counted out crumpled bills to pay for a stranger's gas. And he spoke about it all like it was just part of life. What do you do now? Margaret asked. I get by on my pension and Social Security, Frank said. It's not much, but it's enough. I volunteer at the community food bank 3 days a week. Keeps me busy, gives me a reason to get up in the morning. You volunteer? Margaret heard herself say. After everything you've been through? You spend your time helping other people? Frank looked at her with those kind eyes. What else would I do? Sit here and feel sorry for myself? Besides, there are people who have it worse than me. I've got a roof over my head, food to eat, and my health is mostly good. That's more than a lot of folks can say. Margaret realized she had been sipping her coffee without tasting it. She set the mug down carefully on a coaster that had probably been there since the 80s. Can I ask you something? Why did you pay for my gas? You didn't know me. I was just some stranger who made a stupid mistake. Frank was quiet for a moment, looking down at his own mug. You looked like you needed help, he finally said. That's reason enough, isn't it? Besides, Helen always said that kindness is the one thing we can afford to give away freely. The world's got enough people looking out for only themselves. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes, which surprised her. She couldn't remember the last time something had moved her to tears. I need to pay you back, she said again, her voice thick. Please. All right, Frank said, if it'll make you feel better. $73.50. Like I said. Margaret counted out the exact amount, adding the bills and change until it was precise. Frank took it and set it on the side table without counting it. Thank you for the coffee, Margaret said, standing up. She felt strange, like something had shifted inside her, but she couldn't quite identify what it was. Frank walked her to the door. As she stepped onto the porch, she turned back. That picture of you and your wife at the bakery. You both looked so happy. We were, Frank said simply. Happiest time of our lives, even though we were working 16-hour days and barely making ends meet. Funny how that works, isn't it? The best times aren't always when you have the most. Margaret drove home slowly, thinking about Frank's words. She had always had the most money, the most opportunities, the most comfort. But could she honestly say she was happy? When was the last time she had felt the kind of contentment she saw in Frank's face when he talked about his life with Helen? That night, Margaret pulled up her bank accounts on her laptop, something she rarely did because her financial advisor handled everything. The numbers were bigger than she remembered. She had more money than she could spend in several lifetimes, money she hadn't earned but had simply inherited from her grandfather's tech company fortune. She thought about Frank, counting out his crumpled bills to help a stranger. She thought about him volunteering at a food bank when he could barely afford his own bills. She thought about that sagging porch and peeling paint, and how he seemed more content in that small old house than she had ever felt in her luxury apartment. Margaret closed her laptop and sat in the dark, looking out at the city lights. Something had changed yesterday at that gas station. She just didn't know what to do about it yet. Margaret couldn't stop thinking about Frank. 3 days had passed since she'd visited his house, and she kept replaying their conversation in her mind. It was Thursday afternoon, and she was supposed to meet her friends for lunch at an upscale bistro downtown, but she found herself driving past the exit and heading in a different direction instead. She ended up at the library, of all places. Margaret couldn't remember the last time she'd been inside a public library. She found a computer in the quiet research section and started searching for information about Frank Morrison. It felt slightly invasive, but she needed to understand more about this man who had somehow gotten under her skin. What she found broke her heart. There were old newspaper articles about the bakery, Morrison's sweet shop that Frank and Helen had opened in 2005. The local paper had done a feature on them, calling their cinnamon rolls the best in the county. There were photos of them smiling behind the counter, flour on their aprons, looking tired but genuinely joyful. The article mentioned how they'd used their retirement savings and taken out a loan to follow their dream. Then came the 2008 recession. Margaret found a small notice from 2010 about the bakery closing. No big article this time, just a brief mention in the business section. She kept searching and found records of their debt, public information that made her feel sick to read. Frank and Helen had owed over $150,000 when the bakery failed. Most people would have declared bankruptcy, but the records showed they had spent years making payments, slowly chipping away at what they owed. The last payment had been made in 2019. They had spent nearly a decade paying back every single penny. Margaret sat back in her chair, staring at the computer screen. Frank had been right there at that gas station with probably less than $100 in his wallet, and he'd given her almost all of it without hesitation. A man who had spent 10 years digging himself out of debt, who lived in a house that was falling apart, who wore clothes that had been mended multiple times. And he had helped her, someone who had never worried about money a single day in her entire life. She drove home in a daze and spent the evening on her apartment balcony, watching the sunset and thinking. Her phone rang multiple times. Her mother, her friends, her tennis instructor wanting to reschedule. She ignored all of them. What was she doing with her life? Really doing? She went to the gym, she played tennis, she had lunch with friends who talked about nothing important. She attended charity galas where people wore dresses that cost more than Frank's monthly pension. She sat on the boards of 2 organizations, positions she'd been given because of her last name, not because she'd earned them or even wanted them. Margaret had never created anything, never built anything, never really helped anyone. She wrote checks to charities, sure, but that was easy when you had more money than you knew what to do with. She'd never actually gotten her hands dirty. She'd never known what it felt like to struggle for something, to sacrifice for something, to lose everything, and then spend 10 years fighting to make it right. Her mother called again that evening. This time Margaret answered. "Where have you been?" her mother asked, irritation clear in her voice. "You missed lunch with the Hendersons. They specifically wanted to talk to you about joining the Family Foundation Board." "I was busy," Margaret said. "Busy with what?" "Margaret, this is important. Your father and I won't be around forever, and you need to start taking your responsibilities seriously. The foundation board would be perfect for you. It's only 1 meeting a month, and the rest of the board members are lovely people." Margaret closed her eyes. Her mother meant well in her own way. But the foundation board position was just another thing being handed to her, another role she hadn't earned. The foundation did good work, yes, but what would she actually contribute? She'd just be another wealthy person's name on the letterhead. "I need to think about it," Margaret said. "Think about it?" "Darling, this isn't something you think about. This is an opportunity most people would be grateful for." "I know, Mom. I just need some time." After they hung up, Margaret sat in the silence of her expensive apartment. She looked around at the designer furniture, the original artwork on the walls, the floor-to-ceiling windows with their $1,000,000 view. Everything here had been bought with money she hadn't earned, in a life she hadn't really chosen. She'd simply followed the path of least resistance, letting her family's wealth and name open every door while she floated through without purpose or direction. The next morning, Margaret drove back to Meadowbrook. She told herself she was just checking on Frank, making sure he was okay. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. She needed to be around someone real, someone who understood what it meant to work for something and care about something beyond themselves. Frank's truck wasn't in the driveway. Margaret almost left, but then she noticed an elderly woman working in the garden next door. She walked over. "Excuse me?" Margaret said. "Do you know when Frank might be back?" The woman straightened up, wiping dirt from her hands. "He's at the food bank. Volunteers there every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. Has been for years." "You a friend of his?" "Something like that," Margaret said. "Where's the food bank?" The woman gave her directions to a building on the other side of town. Margaret thanked her and drove over, not entirely sure what she was doing or why. The food bank was in an old warehouse that had been converted into a distribution center. Margaret parked and walked inside, immediately hit by the bustling activity. Volunteers were everywhere, sorting donations, packing boxes, helping families who had come for assistance. And there, near the back, was Frank, lifting boxes that looked too heavy for a man his age. Margaret watched him for a few minutes before he noticed her. When he did, his face registered surprise, then something that might have been concern. "Margaret," he said, walking over. "Everything okay? You need something?" "I just wanted to see you," she said honestly. "Is that strange?" Frank smiled. "Maybe a little. Come on, I'll show you around." He gave her a tour of the facility, introducing her to other volunteers and explaining how everything worked. The food bank served over 300 families a week, Frank told her. Some were homeless, some were working families who still couldn't make ends meet, some were elderly people on fixed incomes who had to choose between medicine and food. Margaret met a single mother with 3 kids who worked 2 jobs but still needed help feeding her family. She met a veteran who had fallen on hard times and was too proud to ask for help until he had no other choice. She met a couple in their 80s who survived on Social Security and needed the food bank to make it through the month. These were real people with real problems, and they weren't abstract concepts on a charity gala invitation. They were here, right in front of her, and volunteers like Frank were actually doing something to help them. "Can I volunteer?" Margaret heard herself ask. Frank looked at her carefully. "You sure about that? It's not glamorous work. We're here at 7 in the morning most days, and it's a lot of heavy lifting and long hours on your feet." "I'm sure," Margaret said, though she wasn't entirely certain she was. "All right then," Frank said. "Come back tomorrow morning at 7. Wear old clothes and comfortable shoes. Leave the fancy purse at home." That evening, Margaret looked through her closet, trying to find something appropriate to wear. Everything was expensive, even her casual clothes. She finally settled on an old pair of jeans she'd bought years ago and a simple t-shirt. She set her alarm for 5:30, earlier than she'd woken up in months. She couldn't sleep that night. Her mind kept racing with questions. What was she doing? Why did this matter so much? Why couldn't she just write a check to the food bank and be done with it like any normal person in her position would do? But she knew the answer. Writing a check was easy. It required nothing from her except money she hadn't earned. What Frank had shown her was something different. He gave his time, his energy, his presence. He showed up. He did the work. He looked people in the eye and treated them with dignity while helping them through their hardest moments. Margaret wanted to know what that felt like. She wanted to be useful, genuinely useful, in a way she never had been before. She wanted to earn something, even if it was just the tired satisfaction of a hard day's work. At 5:30 the next morning, her alarm went off. Margaret got up, got dressed, and drove to the food bank. Frank was already there, along with several other volunteers. He handed her a pair of work gloves and pointed to a pallet of canned goods that needed to be sorted. "Let's see what you're made of," he said with a smile. Margaret pulled on the gloves and got to work. Her old life suddenly felt very far away. Margaret's entire body hurt. She had been volunteering at the food bank for 2 weeks, and muscles she didn't know she had were constantly sore. Her manicured nails were chipped and broken. Her hands had calluses forming. Her back ached from lifting boxes and standing for hours. And somehow, despite all of it, she felt more alive than she had in years. Frank had become something like a mentor to her, though neither of them used that word. He taught her how to properly stack boxes so they wouldn't topple over, how to talk to the families who came through without making them feel ashamed, how to stretch out the supplies when donations ran low. Most importantly, he taught her to listen. One morning, about 3 weeks in, Margaret was helping sort through a donation of baked goods from a local grocery store when Frank came over with a thoughtful expression on his face. "Can I talk to you about something?" he asked. They stepped outside into the parking lot. It was early October now, and the morning air had that crisp quality that meant winter was coming. "I've been thinking," Frank said, leaning against the building, "about that bakery Helen and I used to run, about how much we loved it, even when it was killing us financially. And I've been watching you these past few weeks." Margaret waited, not sure where this was going. "You're good at this," Frank continued. "Better than you probably think. You've got a way with people, and you work harder than most volunteers I've seen. But I can tell you're searching for something. Am I right?" Margaret felt her throat tighten. "Yeah," she admitted. "I am. I just don't know what it is yet." Frank was quiet for a moment, looking out at the morning traffic. "What if we brought the bakery back? Not the same as before, but something different, something that could help people and maybe give both of us a purpose." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked. "A community cafe," Frank said, and she could hear the excitement building in his voice. "A place that serves good food at prices people can afford. We could have one day a week where people pay what they can, even if it's nothing. We could hire folks who need a second chance at work. We could create something that actually matters." Margaret stared at him. "You want to start a business? At 72? "Why not?" Frank shrugged. "I've got the experience. You've got the energy, and if you don't mind me saying, probably the resources to make it happen. We could be partners, real partners, 50-50. "Frank, I don't know anything about running a business," Margaret said. "Neither did I when Helen and I started. You learn as you go." He looked at her seriously. "But here's the thing. If we do this, we do it right. No cutting corners, no taking advantage of people, no shortcuts. We treat our employees fairly, we serve good food, and we give back to the community. That's the deal." Margaret's mind was racing. She had money sitting in investment accounts doing nothing but growing. She could easily afford to fund a small cafe. But this wasn't about the money. This was about actually building something, creating something with her own hands and effort. The idea terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "I need to think about it," she said. "Take all the time you need," Frank replied. "I'm not going anywhere." That evening, Margaret sat down with a notebook and started writing. She researched small business loans, even though she didn't need one. She looked up commercial real estate in Meadowbrook and the surrounding areas. She read articles about community cafes and social enterprises. She stayed up until 2 in the morning, filling pages with ideas and calculations and questions. The next day at the food bank, she pulled Frank aside. "I want to do it," she said. "But I have conditions too." "Let's hear them," Frank said. "You manage the day-to-day operations. You make the decisions about the food, the staff, all of it. I'll handle the business side, the finances, the legal stuff. But Frank, I want to learn everything. I want to work in the kitchen, serve customers, wash dishes if that's what it takes. This can't be me just throwing money at something. I need to actually do the work." Frank extended his hand. "Deal!" They shook on it right there in the middle of the food bank warehouse, and Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. This was real. She was actually going to do something that mattered. The next few months were a blur of activity. Margaret met with lawyers to set up the business structure. She found a small storefront that had been vacant for years, a place with good bones but in desperate need of renovation. Frank walked through it with her, pointing out what they'd need to fix, where the kitchen equipment would go, how they could maximize the seating. Margaret's mother called her one afternoon while she was measuring the space for tables. "Your father and I are concerned," her mother said. "We heard you're opening some kind of restaurant. Margaret, you don't know anything about the restaurant business. It's a terrible investment. Most restaurants fail in the first year." "It's not a restaurant, Mom. It's a community cafe, and I know it's risky." "That's kind of the point. The point is to lose money?" Her mother's voice was sharp with confusion. "The point is to do something meaningful," Margaret said, surprised by how calm she felt. something I actually care about. But the foundation board position is still available. That would be meaningful and much more appropriate for someone in your position. Margaret took a deep breath. I'm not taking the board position, Mom. I'm doing this instead. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Your grandfather built his fortune so you wouldn't have to struggle. And here you are, choosing to struggle. Maybe that's exactly what I need, Margaret said quietly. After they hung up, Margaret sat in the empty storefront and looked around. The place was a mess. The walls needed painting. The floors needed refinishing. The kitchen needed completely new equipment. It would take months of work and a significant amount of money, and she couldn't wait to get started. Frank began teaching her to bake at 5 in the morning before they both went to volunteer at the food bank. Margaret's expensive apartment started smelling like bread and cinnamon. She learned that baking was chemistry and art combined, that you had to feel the dough to know when it was right, that timing was everything. She burned batches of cookies. She forgot to add salt to bread. She set off her smoke alarm so many times her neighbors complained. But slowly, gradually, she started to get better. And more than that, she started to understand why Frank and Helen had loved this so much. There was something deeply satisfying about creating something with your own hands, about taking simple ingredients and turning them into something that brought people joy. 3 months after that conversation in the parking lot, they signed the lease on the storefront. Margaret wrote the check without hesitation. They hired a contractor who Frank knew from his old neighborhood, someone reliable who wouldn't overcharge them. The renovations began. Margaret showed up every day in her work clothes, her hair tied back, doing whatever needed to be done. She painted walls, she assembled furniture, she scrubbed floors on her hands and knees. Her friends stopped calling after a while, unable to understand why she'd given up tennis and lunch dates for this. But Frank was there every day too, despite his age, working alongside her. Other volunteers from the food bank came by to help. The single mother Margaret had met brought her kids, and they helped paint a mural on one wall. The elderly couple came by with sandwiches for the workers. The veteran installed shelving with the precision of someone who had been in the military. A community was forming around this little cafe before it even opened, and Margaret realized that this was what had been missing from her life. Connection, purpose, the feeling of being part of something larger than herself. One evening, about 4 months into the renovation, Margaret and Frank sat on the floor of what would soon be the dining area, eating pizza and looking at their progress. "You know," Frank said, "Helen would have loved this. She always said that food brings people together, that a good meal can change someone's whole day." "I wish I could have met her," Margaret said. "She would have liked you," Frank replied. She always believed people could change, could become better versions of themselves if they had the chance. Margaret looked around at the space they were creating together. "Do you think we can really make this work?" Frank smiled. "We already are making it work. The cafe is just the next part." Margaret nodded, feeling a contentment she'd never experienced before. She was tired, sore, and covered in paint. Her bank account was significantly lighter. Her mother was disappointed in her. Her old friends thought she'd lost her mind, and she had never been happier. The cafe opened on a cold morning in late January, almost exactly a year after that day at the gas station. Margaret stood behind the counter at 6 in the morning, her hands shaking slightly as she checked the coffee machines one more time. Frank was in the kitchen, preparing the first batch of cinnamon rolls that had once made Morrison's sweet shop famous. They had decided to call it Frank and Margaret's Community Kitchen. Simple, honest, exactly what it was. The first customer arrived at 7 sharp. It was the elderly woman who lived next door to Frank, the one who had given Margaret directions to the food bank all those months ago. She ordered coffee and a blueberry muffin, and when Margaret handed her the order, the woman squeezed her hand. "You two did something special here," she said. "The neighborhood needed this." By 8 o'clock, there was a line out the door. Word had spread through the community about the new cafe, about the Pay What You Can Wednesdays, about how Frank and Margaret had hired people who couldn't get jobs anywhere else. Their first employee was a young man who had been in prison and was struggling to find work. Their second was a woman in her 50s who had been unemployed for 2 years. Their third was a teenager who had dropped out of school and needed a chance. Margaret worked the counter while Frank supervised the kitchen, but they had agreed from the start that she would learn every position. Over the following weeks, she learned to work the espresso machine, to time the pastries perfectly, to handle the morning rush without losing her mind. She learned the names of regular customers, remembered their orders, asked about their families. The Pay What You Can Wednesdays were both the hardest and most rewarding part. Some people left $20 for a $10 meal. Others left $2 and an apology. Some left nothing at all. But Margaret and Frank had agreed that was okay. The point wasn't to make money on Wednesdays. The point was to feed people who needed feeding and to do it with dignity. Margaret's parents finally visited 3 months after the opening. Her mother walked in wearing a designer suit, looking completely out of place among the mismatched furniture and hand-painted walls. Her father followed behind, quieter, taking everything in with careful eyes. Margaret was working the counter, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing jeans and the cafe's t-shirt with flowers smudged on it. She saw them come in and felt her stomach clench, but she finished serving the customer in front of her before walking over. "Hi, Mom." "Dad," she said. "Want some coffee?" Her mother looked around, and Margaret couldn't quite read her expression. "So this is it. This is what you gave up everything for." "I didn't give up anything," Margaret said quietly. "I found something." Her father had wandered over to look at the mural the kids had painted, a colorful scene of people gathered around a table sharing a meal. "Who did this?" he asked. "A family from the neighborhood. The mom volunteers at the food bank with us sometimes." Margaret's father turned to look at her, really look at her, in a way he hadn't in years. "You seem different," he said. "I am different," Margaret replied. They sat down at a corner table, and Margaret brought them coffee and fresh cinnamon rolls. Frank came out from the kitchen, and Margaret introduced them. Her mother was polite, but distant. Her father shook Frank's hand and asked questions about the business, about their plans, about how things were going. "She works too hard," Frank said with a smile. "Gets here at 5:30 every morning and doesn't leave until closing. I keep telling her to take a day off." "I could say the same about you," Margaret shot back. Her mother watched this exchange with something that might have been understanding beginning to dawn on her face. "You're happy," she said to Margaret, and it wasn't quite a question. "Yeah, Mom, I really am." They didn't stay long, but as they were leaving, Margaret's father pulled her aside. "Your grandfather started with nothing," he said quietly. "Built his whole company from scratch in a garage. I think he would have been proud of this." "Proud of you for building something yourself." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. "Thanks, Dad." After they left, Frank came and stood beside her. "That went better than you expected, didn't it?" "Yeah," Margaret said, wiping her eyes. "Yeah, it did." The cafe became a fixture in the neighborhood. They started hosting community events, open mic nights, book clubs. Local artists displayed their work on the walls. High school students came in to study, buying one coffee and staying for hours, and Margaret and Frank never asked them to leave. One afternoon, about 6 months after opening, Margaret was wiping down tables when she noticed Frank moving slower than usual. She walked over to him. "You okay?" she asked. "Just tired," Frank said. "Getting old, you know." But Margaret insisted he see a doctor, and after some arguing, he agreed. The doctor said Frank needed to cut back on his hours, that he was pushing himself too hard for a man his age. Frank was devastated. The cafe had given him new life, new purpose, and the thought of stepping back was almost unbearable. "You're not stepping back," Margaret told him firmly. "You're adjusting. You come in later, leave earlier. You supervise instead of doing all the heavy lifting yourself. Frank, we need you healthy. I need you healthy. You're not just my business partner, you're family." Frank's eyes got watery and he nodded. "You're family too, kid. You know that, right?" They hugged there in the empty cafe, and Margaret realized how much her life had changed. A year and a half ago, she had been a directionless heiress who had never worked for anything. Now she was a small business owner who worked 60 hours a week and loved every minute of it. By the time they hit their one-year anniversary, the cafe had served over 50,000 meals. They had hired 8 employees, all of them people who had struggled to find work elsewhere. They had started a program where high school students could learn job skills by working part-time at the cafe. They had expanded their Pay What You Can program to twice a week. Margaret stood in the dining room on the morning of their anniversary, looking at all the people gathered there. Employees, regular customers, volunteers from the food bank, neighbors, friends. Frank stood beside her, looking healthier after cutting back his hours, a huge smile on his weathered face. Someone had brought a cake. Someone else had made a banner. The teenager who worked the afternoon shift had put together a slideshow of photos from the past year, showing the renovation, the opening day, the community events, the faces of all the people who had become part of this place. Margaret's parents were there too, sitting at a table with some of the regular customers. Her father was talking to the veteran about something, both of them laughing. Her mother was holding a baby for one of the young employees, looking more relaxed than Margaret had seen her in years. "Speech!" someone called out, and others joined in. Margaret looked at Frank, who gestured for her to go ahead. She took a deep breath. "A year and a half ago," she started, "I ran out of gas on a highway and made a stupid mistake. I forgot my wallet and couldn't pay. And this man," she gestured to Frank, "a complete stranger, paid $73.50 for me without knowing anything about me." People smiled, some nodding. They had heard this story before. "I came back to pay him back because that seemed like the right thing to do. But what I found was so much more than that. I found someone who showed me what it meant to actually live, to work for something, to care about something bigger than yourself. Frank didn't just pay for my gas that day. He gave me a chance to become who I was supposed to be." Margaret's voice caught, and she paused to collect herself. This cafe exists because Frank believed that people can change, that kindness matters, that we're all responsible for taking care of each other. Every person in this room has taught me something about what it means to be part of a community, and I'm grateful, every single day, for that moment at the gas station that changed everything. Frank stepped forward and put his arm around Margaret's shoulders. "What she's not saying," he added, "is that she's the one who made all this possible. She took a risk on an old man's dream and worked harder than anyone I've ever seen. Helen would have loved her." They cut the cake, and the celebration continued, people laughing and talking and sharing stories. Later, as Margaret was cleaning up, she found Frank standing in front of the mural, looking at it with a distant expression. "Thinking about Helen?" Margaret asked softly. "Yeah," Frank said. "Wishing she could see all this, wishing she could have been part of it." "I think she is," Margaret said. "I think she's here in everything we do." Frank smiled and looked around the cafe. At the mismatched chairs and hand-painted walls, at the community they had built together. "You know what the best part is?" he said. "We're just getting started. Imagine what we can do in the next year, the next 5 years." Margaret grinned. "You think we should open another location?" "Maybe," Frank said with a twinkle in his eye. "But let's make sure we're taking care of this one first, and that I'm taking my naps like the doctor ordered." They locked up together that night, turning off the lights and stepping out into the cool evening air. Margaret looked up at the sign above the door, Frank and Margaret's community kitchen, and felt that same sense of contentment that had become familiar over the past year. "Thank you," she said to Frank, "for everything." "No," Frank replied, putting his hand on her shoulder. "Thank you. You gave me a reason to wake up in the morning again. You gave me purpose. That's worth more than all the money in the world." They walked to their cars together, making plans for tomorrow, for next week, for next month. And Margaret thought about that gas station, about $73.50, about how the smallest act of kindness can change absolutely everything if you let it.